My name is Anna Cavazzini. I'm a Green member of the European Parliament from Germany, the vice-president of the delegation to Brazil and chair of the Internal Market Committee in this parliament.
Hello, Anna. Many thanks for joining us. I would like to start by asking you to explain to our Brazilian readers the current status of the European Union Green Deal, please.
The Green Deal is the overarching goal to create a complete climate neutral economy in the European Union, the latest until 2050, but probably even faster. And or the Green Deal consists of several pieces of legislation that make sure that we reach this goal, for example, when it comes to expanding renewable energies, but also circular economy. So many pieces of legislations are being negotiated at the moment to create this environment for reaching climate neutrality and really also keeping up our competitiveness or even increasing it, because we think this is the future. The future can only be climate neutral. We Greens, unfortunately, are not in the majority in the European Parliament, and a lot of the legislations that we are voting on don't go far enough. So it is always very big political, ideological fights in the European Parliament, but also in the member states on how far we can go. Let's say the right side of the parliament says, okay, if we go too far, we destroy our economy. We say, if we don't protect the climate, we also destroy our economy and the future of our planet. And for us, it is, we say we are on the right track, we are going into the right direction, but we need to go faster.
Anna, you are a member of the International Trade Committee. How can trade contribute to the fight against climate change and for the protection of the human rights?
At the moment, how trade is organized and how the WTO works and how a lot of bilateral trade agreements work, we see a lot of problems when it comes to causing climate change or when it comes to really protect human rights. First of all, they should not impede local and national governments in deciding for climate change measures. Secondly, we need really enforceable sustainability standards in trade agreements, and that sustainability should be mainstreamed in all trade agreements. And thirdly, I think we also need to look at the transport, because also how the global transport works and shipping goods from one continent to the other all the time needs to be also made more sustainable.
What are your views on the EU regulation for deforestation-free supply chains? And what comes next in relation to this process?
Yeah, I was negotiating this file in the Internal Market Committee and followed it very closely. I think this new regulation is really a kind of a revolution, because for the first time we have rules in the European Union that look at supply chains and will at the end prohibit imports from goods from deforested areas. And this is a big step forward in the global fight against deforestation. And we in the European Parliament, especially we Greens, managed to strengthen the Commission proposal. We could not at the end get everything what we wanted in the negotiations with the member states. Nevertheless, I think it is really a very good regulation and will also hopefully have impacts on Brazil and help to combat deforestation in Brazil. It is important that stakeholders in Brazil who export goods that are regulated by this new law really adapt and make sure that, they are not deforesting much, but concentrate on areas that are already deforested or that are already like fields. So I think it is important to understand that the more Brazil doesn't deforest anymore, the easier it is also for economic exports at the end.
How to engage with countries such as China and Russia that are less engaged with the social and environmental agendas?
It is very important to cooperate with other countries because, of course, there is the fear that companies then export their clean products to the EU market, but then the other products from areas that had been deforested recently to China. And that's why it is really, really important to get countries like China on board. There is already a lot of outreach. There is like negotiations with China or Russia. I think we also need really a global understanding on that. I think the COP agreement of December of the UN Biodiversity Conference is really helping.
And how to deal with forced labor in supply chains, even in certified products, as you have recently denounced.
We all know that worldwide millions of people are in situation of forced labor. The numbers had even increased in the last 2 years, also because of the pandemic, now because of the inflation and economic difficulties. And it's really a tragedy. Consumers all around the world, I'm looking at the European consumers, they're kind of contributing to forced labor without their knowledge, without them wanting that, because they buy products that contain potentially forced labor. So for us, for me, it was really important in the last 3 years since the beginning of my mandate in the European Parliament to have a legislation on it, to make sure that not consumers need to look at labels and see, okay, is this really fair trade or whatever, but have a safety net that really forbids product made with forced labor on the EU market. And after pressure, after the Parliament really asked for it, the Commission came out with a legislative proposal in last autumn, and now we will start the legislative discussions in the European Parliament, and hopefully at the end have a legislation that forbids products made with forced labor on the EU market.
EU negotiators have recently reached an agreement on the refinement and updating of the EU emissions trading scheme. What does it mean?
It means that we are really getting the biggest climate legislation in the world. And this is why it is so important, of course, also because the European Union is one of the biggest emitters, also historically. And this is why the reform of this emissions trading scheme that kicks out a lot of certificates and will make basically the CO2 price higher in Europe, and thus automatically basically cap the CO2 emissions and hopefully brings us on the 1.5 degree path. So this law is, I think, a major step forward.
And what should happen in order for Europe to reduce its dependence on the Russia oil and gas imports? In particular, considering the rise of the imports of Russia's liquefied gas in the last few years.
Yeah, the horrible war in the Ukraine has unfortunately shown what actually we as Greens had been saying for some years already, that it is dangerous, that we're really making ourselves so much dependent on authoritarian regimes, on our fossil fuels imports. So fossil fuels in general make you dependent, while renewable energies are kind of like freedom energies. You can produce it at home, you can use your wind, your solar, and so on. So we think that the acceleration of renewable energies, but also any legislation that helps us reducing the energy consumption and the resource use, like circular economy, will help us to get rid of Russian fossil fuel.
And Anna, what's your work as the vice chair of the Delegation of Relations with Brazil, and what are the priorities of the delegation for this year?
The delegation will finally visit Brazil. It was very difficult in the last years because of the COVID crisis, and then because of also political circumstances. But now we plan to have our first travel mission to Brazil in May. And I think this is really good because the most important thing is also to exchange with our parliamentarian counterparts and to see what are the debates in Brazil, what are the debates in Europe, how we can exchange. In the last 2 years, I personally focused very much on the fight against deforestation, and supporting everyone in Brazil who was fighting for human rights and the rule of law and democracy and environment. And of course, now the context luckily changes a little bit with the new government, and I think there's much more avenues and areas for cooperation right now than before.
And Anna, to finish our interview, I'd like to ask you, what could we do in order to move forward the EU-Mercosul trade deal, something that the Minister of Environment, Silva, is really committed with?
the Brazilian government needs to re-establish all the environmental legislation and institutions that were dismantled by Bolsonaro, because I think without that, we cannot have any trade agreement that spurs further deforestation on exports of agricultural goods, while we don't have a safety net that no more deforestation happens. So I think this is a precondition for me to have any talks about any trade agreement. And then I think parts of the trade agreement needs to be adjusted. It is a very old text from 20 years ago. It has really non-binding sustainability standards that at the end will not have a great effect. So we need to adjust this and put sustainability and the fight against deforestation in the core of the agreement. And only then it can advance, I think.